The 1960s, a time of prosperity, but not equality. The American people were thrust into political change and social turmoil.
For African Americans living in the United States of America during the Kennedy administration, November 22, 1963 was a beacon of hope for the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is a term that describes the period between the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, in which African Americans fought for voting rights, the cessation of segregation, and the end of legal discrimination based on race. This followed years of race-based slavery and the enforcement of segregation through Jim Crow laws. John F. Kennedy's tragic death expedited the civil rights movement, by replacing Kennedy's unclear stance and timid maneuvers with Johnson's firm position and cutthroat negotiation tactics.
In 1960, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon took part in the first televised presidential debate in America. A prominent theme discussed was the growing unrest in the African American population regarding civil rights. Kennedy was quick to say,
"I'm not satisfied until every American enjoys his full constitutional rights."
It was made clear to the American people that Kennedy's acts as president would support civil rights. However, Kennedy's outward support did not parallel his private stance on the issue. There were many controversial events where race was pertinent, and Kennedy was forced to take a position on civil rights. In 1962, Kennedy sent the National Guard to the University of Mississippi to ensure that an African American student, James Meredith, was allowed to attend the fall semester. In 1963, the police brutality at the Birmingham, Alabama demonstrations pushed civil rights to the forefront of Kennedy's domestic policy goals. Public revulsion put pressure on Kennedy to quickly condemn racist actions writ large. Kennedy presented a comprehensive civil rights bill to the House of Representatives in June of 1963. The bill included protection of voting rights, the disallowance of segregation in public accommodations, and the ability of the Attorney General to take legal action against states that broke civil rights laws. Although the bill had a fair amount of bipartisan support, it was stalled in the Rules Committee by a Virginia Democrat, Howard Smith.
Although Kennedy outwardly appeared to support civil rights, there remains a discrepancy in historian literature between what Kennedy accomplished for the civil rights movement and how he discussed civil rights behind closed doors. In private, Kennedy was less enthusiastic about the subject. Kennedy opted to remain neutral unless it was necessary to take action, as he was fearful of revolt and resistance from southern states towards the federal government. In early 1963, civil rights leaders King and Randolph met with Kennedy at the White House to discuss a march on Washington, which Kennedy strongly opposed. Kennedy reasoned that the march would only heighten racial tensions and further divide the country because of Southern reaction. The leaders blatantly refused to cancel, and Kennedy finally gave his support only after he saw the success of the march. It is clear that Kennedy's decisions on civil rights were purely political. He gave speeches that electrified the nation, but when it came to firm political action, he was inept.
Historians such as James W. Riddlesberger, Robert Weisbrod, and Nikhil Singh blatantly assume that Kennedy always supported the March on Washington as his legacy is based on his fight for equality for all. But Janice Hamlet observes that Kennedy only supported the march when he realized its success. Riddlesberger, Weisbrod, and Singh described Kennedy's outward support of civil rights, whereas Hamlet estimated Kennedy's inward viewpoint on the issue. This split between Kennedy's public opinion and private ruling on civil rights led to a lack of firm legislation passed during his presidency. In contrast to Kennedy's moderate leadership style, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was a force for change.
Johnson was from the deep south or Texas. He was kind of a good old boy who knew how to work the legislative process, knew how to do horse trading, knew how to bargain, knew how to get legislation done, knew how to give out favors and when to call favors in. Kennedy, on the other hand, was more of an inspirational, charismatic type of figure.
Johnson, a Texas-born Democrat, was an outspoken advocate of the civil rights movement. When discussing Johnson, political commentator James Reston said, quote, Johnson has, on the race problem, been the most effective mediator between the North and South, end quote. Because Johnson was from the South, he could persuade congressmen to be in favor of equal rights. In contrast, Kennedy was just another Northerner pushing for civil rights. When Johnson lost to Kennedy in the 1960 primary elections, Johnson begrudgingly accepted the vice presidency. Johnson felt restricted with the powers he held as vice president, and privately criticized the way in which Kennedy ran his administration. Kennedy's desire to keep the white vote can also explain the passiveness of his civil rights activism. Johnson was direct and aggressive when he negotiated. He knew the inner workings of Congress especially well. Johnson's limited powers as vice president explains much of the inability in Kennedy's administration to get bills passed.
Then, on November 22, 1963, everything changed. Just after Kennedy had started publicly supporting a civil rights agenda, he was assassinated. Kennedy traveled to Texas to unite the conservative and liberal wings of the Texas Democratic Party to better his chances for re-election. The President, the First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, Texas Governor John Connally, and his wife Nellie were riding to John F. Kennedy's speech event through the streets of Dallas in an open-car motorcade. Both Kennedy and Connally were shot, and Kennedy was declared dead at 1 p.m. At 2:38 p.m., Lyndon B. Johnson became the President of the United States.
It was just horrible being in Boston that day. Everybody in the subway was crying. It was just something I would never want to go through again.
And an inspirational figure like that, it's almost like you feel like part of your own soul and your hopes for the future are dashed. It's a very, very strong, depressing emotion.
Johnson, obtaining his long-awaited political control, took full advantage of Kennedy's passing. At his first presidential address, he said,
The dream of equal rights for all Americans, whatever their race or color. These and other American dreams have been vitalized by his drive and by his dedication. And now these ideas and the ideals which he so nobly represented must and will be translated into effective action.
Johnson could persuade Congress to pass a civil rights bill because he derived legitimacy from the legacy of a fallen hero. He also utilized the nation's fear to support the bill. He proposed the bill not as a solution to the civil rights discrepancies, but as a solution to the terror of a nation with a deceased leader. As Kennedy was heavily involved in civil rights issues like freedom rides, the protection of James Meredith, the Birmingham riot, and the March on Washington, Johnson could easily portray the Civil Rights Act as an obligation to honor Kennedy's memory. Essentially, Kennedy's assassination gave Johnson the authority to guilt-trip every congressman and senator into voting for the Civil Rights Act, or label them as against Kennedy in elections expediting passage of the bill. Johnson's knowledge of the inner workings of Congress allowed him to bypass the Rules Committee by encouraging the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee to take out the bill. After an arduous legislative battle, the bill passed the House in February of 1964. The Senate Judiciary Committee head, James Eastland, was a segregationist and would have easily stalled the bill, but Johnson pushed Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield into filibustering. The segregationists held a record 57-day filibuster in response, but there was simply nothing Southern Democrats could do. Finally, on June 10, 1964, the bill was passed.
Enacted on July 2nd, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a defining moment in American history. By legally ending segregation and voting discrimination, the act provides a basis for those in need of civil liberty. Kennedy's torn viewpoint would have easily carried through his presidency had that unthinkable tragedy not occurred, translating to the continued stalling of the bill. But tragedy led to triumph. An assassinated leader spurred civil rights legislation promoting true liberty and justice for all.